The buggy came up the boundary road just after 8 in the morning, when the mud had gone sticky soft at the edges, but hadn't warmed through enough to pull at the wheels. She heard it coming before it cleared the bend. One horse moving faster than the ruts deserved, a man who'd decided where he was going 3 miles back and hadn't reconsidered since. She was on the front step already. She'd been there since first light, the boy's wool mitten in her lap, needles moving without her having to watch them. The one last row she'd put off finishing for longer than she could reasonably explain. She did not look up when the buggy turned in through the gate. She set another row. She finished it. Only then did she stand. The man who climbed down was built like the man whose letter she had folded in her apron pocket. Wide across the chest, going soft in the middle the way men did once they stopped working land and started managing it. He had the same way of standing as if the ground owed him a level surface. He took off his hat and held it in both hands, and he did not say good morning. "I'm his uncle," he said, "by blood, his only family now that my brother's passed." She said nothing. "He's mine to take." He reached inside his coat for a folded paper. "I've had it drawn up proper. The county sees it the same as I do." She looked at the paper. She did not reach for it. "I have a letter," she said. She said it the way she'd name a price, just the fact of it, nothing added. "Written in his hand, witnessed by Dr. Broom before the end. It names me guardian, not caretaker, not temporary." He blinked at that. Something shifted in his face, the look of a man who'd come expecting a door and found a wall. "That's not the same as legal." "No," she said, "it isn't, and neither is that." She looked once at the paper in his hand. "He stays." Behind her, she could hear the boy moving about in the kitchen, the scuff of boots on the floorboards, the particular sound of someone trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. The man stood for a moment longer. He looked past her toward the door, then back at her face, and whatever he'd been prepared to say to a woman he could talk past, he hadn't prepared for this one. He put his hat back on. He got back into the buggy, the way a man gets into something when the conversation hasn't gone the way he built it in his head. The horse turned in the yard. She watched the buggy take the gate and start back down the boundary road, and she did not move until the sound of it had gone around the far bend, and the morning settled back to what it had been before. The creek running off the eaves, a robin making noise in the spruce, nothing else. Then she sat back down on the step and picked up the needles and went on with the row she'd interrupted. 10 days before the buggy came, Dr. Broom had arrived on a horse that wasn't his, a bay gelding with a white sock he'd borrowed from the livery on account of his own mare having gone lame in February and not come right. She saw him from the window as he dismounted at the gate, and her first thought was the boy's chest. He'd had a bad week in March. A cough that settled into his ribs like something that had made itself comfortable. The doctor didn't say anything about the cough. He stood in the yard with his bag in one hand and his hat still on, which told her something before he spoke, and he held out an envelope with the other hand. The paper was soft at the corners, carried a long time, the wax on the back cracked but not broken. "He gave me this in December," the doctor said, "before the ground froze, asked me to bring it to you come thaw." She took it. It was heavier than she expected and warm from being carried inside his coat the whole ride out. "You knew," she said. "I knew he was arranging things." Dr. Broom looked at his boots. "He told me enough to understand what he was doing, not everything." She set the letter on the kitchen table without opening it, where the boy couldn't reach the edge, and put the kettle on because her hands needed something to do. That wasn't waiting. The doctor stood in the doorway and didn't come further, the spring air cold enough still to make the curtains shift around him. When she broke the wax, her hands were steady. She read the letter quickly the first time, the way you read something that might hurt, scanning for how bad, and then slow the second time, each sentence carrying its full weight. It was not a letter asking her to see a child through a season. It was written in handwriting gone small and careful with effort. The pen pressed harder at some words than others, and it named her by full intention, guardian of his son. Not until he was collected. Not until some other arrangement could be made. Guardian. The word sat in the middle of the page, and she read it 3 times before it settled into something she could hold. The boy was in the yard. She could see him through the window, crouching by the woodpile looking at something in the bark. She watched him for a moment. "He didn't tell me this," she said. "No," the doctor said. "I don't expect he told you anything he thought you'd push back on." She folded the letter back into thirds. Outside, the boy had stood up and was now carrying a piece of split wood toward the door, both arms around it, his chin tucked over the top. Helping, or trying to, the way he'd been trying all winter, learning what work looked like here, in this house, which was different from the work he'd grown up watching. She put the letter in her apron pocket and left it there. Earlier than that, February, the cold settled in for real, the kind that didn't lift between dawn and dusk. She was woken by a sound from the back room. Not a cry, not quite that. A sound like a wheel that had caught and wouldn't turn. She was across the room before she'd finished waking. The boy was sitting up in his cot with his hands pressed flat on his own thighs, the blankets pooled at his waist, eyes open and fixed on something that wasn't in the room. "Bad dream," she said, not a question. He didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind was working the loose shutter on the north side, a low complaining sound that had been there for 3 weeks and that she kept meaning to fix. "He used to hum," the boy said. She went still. "Papa." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration. Not a real song, just a few notes. The same ones, over and over. He didn't know he was doing it, I don't think. A pause. I used to count how many times before he'd stop. She did not ask what the count was. She did not ask how many nights he had spent listening through a wall, counting notes, waiting for the silence that came after to mean something other than what it did. She reached over and pulled the blanket back up around his shoulders and tucked the edge the way she'd been tucking it all winter, the same movement each time, so it would feel like something he could expect. "That's the shutter," she said. "That's all it is tonight." "I know," he said. He said it without any sting in it. Not defensive, just accurate. "I know what it is. I just needed to say it out loud to somebody." She sat on the edge of the cot until his breathing went even, and his hands unclenched from the blanket's edge. The shutter worked the same groove it always worked. She sat longer than she needed to. Then she went out to the front room and banked the stove, though it didn't need banking, and stayed there a long time in the dark, thinking that some sounds, once you've named them to another person, don't go back to being only yours. They become something shared, which is not the same as being made smaller. Sometimes it is the opposite of that. Before the February night, there was January, the ice on the creek the boy wanted to test every morning, and the same thing she said about it each time, until one day she said nothing and he understood, from the silence, what she meant. There was a Tuesday when the harness on Mrs. Aldgate's mare had to be resoled. Mrs. Aldgate drove out herself with the traces in the back of her sleigh, and the boy watched the whole repair from a stool in the corner, without asking a word, just watching, the way he'd been watching everything since October. Not like a child who didn't understand, like someone mapping the shape of a place. Afterward, when Mrs. Aldgate had gone back down the road and the shop was quiet again, he asked if he could try. She didn't answer right away. She handed him a length of waxed thread and a needle with an eye wide enough for his fingers, showed him once how to push through and pull back, and then stepped aside. His first stitches were long and uncertain, the thread drawing the leather into a small pucker where he'd cinched too tight. He looked up at her face the way children look when they're braced for correction. She didn't take the work from him. She didn't undo a stitch. "Keep the tension even," she said. "Don't pull against it, let it seat." He bent back over it. The next 3 stitches were better. Not good, but better. By the end of the run, the seam was uneven, 1 stitch loose enough to need redoing come summer, but it lay flat and it would hold. He held it up without saying anything. "That'll do," she said. And she meant it, and he heard that she meant it, and looked at the work again as if it had become a slightly different thing than it had been a moment before. She did redo the loose stitch that evening, after he was in bed. She didn't mention it, neither did he. She had known about the death since the night of December 23rd, which was not a night she would have chosen for news of that kind, though news of that kind did not arrange itself around convenience. Dr. Broom came after supper. 2 short knocks, a pause, then one more. His habit from 30 years of announcing himself to houses where someone was already frightened enough. She knew the knock before she reached the door. He stood on the step with snow on his shoulders and something in the set of his face that said it before he did. "Sometime this afternoon," he said. He'd sent his hired man away for Christmas, sent the boy here in October so he wouldn't have to watch. He glanced past her toward the dark hallway. Was the boy already asleep? "Since 7, she said. "Good." The doctor shifted his bag from one hand to the other. "His brother will know by morning. I sent word out to the homestead before I came here." "Did you say anything about the boy?" "No," the doctor said. "Wasn't my place to." She nodded once. "No, it isn't." He turned back toward his horse, standing patient in the snow with its head low, and she closed the door as quietly as she could. The latch made no sound at all. She stood in the front room for a long time without lighting the lamp. The boy was 3 rooms away, asleep. His hands curled the way they curled when he was deep under. Loose fists turned up, like something open and unguarded. She could not hear him from here, but she knew the rhythms of his sleeping by now. The small shift he made around midnight. The way his breathing changed an hour before he woke. She would not tell him tonight. Not with the snow falling soft and 3 more days of quiet still undisturbed in the house. She went to the front room chair and sat in the dark and did not sleep, and the unfinished mitten sat in the basket by the stove where she'd left it 6 weeks earlier. Both needles still threaded, the second one half done and no further. She had started the mittens in the first week of November, once it was clear the cold meant to stay, and the single pair the boy had arrived with weren't going to last a Canadian winter. Red wool, a pattern her hands knew without instruction. She'd finished the left one in 4 evenings. She'd started the right on the 5th, gotten perhaps a third of the way through the thumb gusset, and stopped. Not because she'd run short of wool, not because anything was wrong with the work. She stopped because of a thought that arrived without invitation, the way thoughts did when the hands were occupied, and the mind was left alone in a corner with no particular errand. The thought was this, that to finish this mitten was to assume the hand that would go into it, that to cast off the last row was to make a claim about what spring would look like. A boy here to wear them through mud season, past mud season, into whatever came next. That she had decided something without anyone having told her in words that it was hers to decide. She had not decided that, not formally, not in anything she could be held to. She set the half-finished mitten in the basket, with the needles still in it, and did not pick it up again. It sat on the left side of the basket through the rest of November. She looked at it each evening when she moved the basket to reach the tools underneath. She looked at it the way you look at a letter you haven't opened yet. Not avoiding exactly, just not going toward it either. December came. The boy learned where the extra blankets were kept and stopped asking before he took one. He learned that the 3rd step creaked and stepped over it on his own, without anyone telling him to. He learned that she took her coffee without sugar, and that the sugar tin lived on a different shelf than the salt, and that this was on purpose. She watched him learn these things. She said nothing about them. The mittens stayed in the basket. 3 weeks before December, and the knock at the door. The father had written the letter at his kitchen table alone, the lamp turned low, the fire gone to coals. She knew this later, from the doctor, from the evidence of the letter itself. The handwriting fine and deliberate at the start, looser toward the end, the way a man writes when what he has left is borrowed and the account is running down. She had not been there. She had been here 17 miles down the boundary road, watching a boy learn the weight of firewood and the sound of a house in deep winter. He had folded the letter in thirds. He had sealed it with the wax from the kitchen drawer, the same stub kept for jarring preserves, and pressed a coin into it before he thought better of the gesture and smoothed it flat. The doctor had told her that detail without being asked, as though it explained something, which it did. He had not sent for her. He had not told her what he was arranging. He had done what a man does when he understands that some things, spoken aloud in advance, become arguments, and he did not have the breath left to spend on arguments. She had learned about the brothers' visit later from Mrs. Aldgate, who had it from someone in town, who had it from the brother himself, that he had ridden out to the homestead 3 weeks before the boy was brought to her, and had sat in the room where the sick man lay and told him his view of things. Blood was blood. The ranch had room. The boy would have cousins, familiar faces, a proper household, people who bore the same name. And the sick man, by all accounts, had looked at the small boots by the door and said only, "Come April. If I'm not standing, come ask her yourself." "Not me," he'd said, "her." The brother had left without pressing further. But he'd remember it come April. She understood, when Mrs. Aldgate told her this over the traces of the mare, that he would remember it, and that April was no longer a long way off. He had come to her door. On the first Thursday of October, the frost barely started, the ground not yet stiff. A man she didn't know. He tied his horse at the gate and walked to the step and stopped at the bottom of it, keeping the boards between them the way people do when they're not sure of the welcome. She had been sitting with a piece of bridle leather across her knee, working at a buckle that had corroded over the summer, when she heard the gate. She didn't stop working. He had the look of a man who had been managing something for a long time and was close to the end of what managing could do. Not beaten, just near the edge of what he'd been able to carry alone. He did not introduce himself. He said, "I have a boy, 7 years old. His mother's been gone 2 years. She set the bridle leather down. "I need someone to take him," he said. "Through the winter, maybe longer." He did not explain why longer might matter more than winter. He stood in the October light with his hat in his hands and his breath not quite level. And she'd already understood what she was looking at before he said another word. "I can pay," he said. "I've got some acres along the creek, good bottomland. It's yours if you'll do it." She looked at him for a long time and he let her look. The horse shifted at the gate. A pair of nuthatches worked the bark of the spruce by the fence, noisy about it, taking turns. "Can he work?" she said. He blinked. It wasn't what he'd expected. "He's 7. "I know how old he is," she said. "Can he work?" "He's willing," the man said. "Whether he can or not is a different question." "All right," she said. "All right," meaning yes? "Meaning bring him Sunday," she said, "and have the acres signed before you come." "Not promised, signed." He stood there another moment, the way men did when they'd rehearsed for more resistance than they met, and didn't quite know what to do with the quiet. Then he put his hat back on, and went down the step and untied his horse, and rode back down the road without looking back. She picked up the bridle leather and went on with the buckle. The nuthatches kept at the spruce. The frost had not come yet to the step, but she could feel it waiting in the air just above the ground. Patient, unhurried, having done this before, certain of its season. That had been October, this was May. The mud on the boundary road had dried enough in the past week that boot heels made a sound in it, a satisfying thud that the boy had discovered, and that she'd caught him doing on purpose twice, once on the way to the gate and once on the way back, testing whether the sound was repeatable. It was. She had said nothing about it. She had listened to it and noticed, without examining the noticing, that she was glad of it. She was on the step. The mitten she'd left unfinished in November was finished now. She couldn't have said exactly when she'd picked up the needles again, only that one evening it had seemed like the natural thing to do, and she had done it and it was done. Both of them, the left and the right, a matched pair, hanging on the peg below the boy's coat by the door, no longer waiting for anything. He was inside. She could hear him at the table. The scrape of a chair leg, the quiet that meant he was drawing or reading or doing, one of the things he had learned to do without requiring company, the way he'd been learning all winter to be alone without being lonely, which was a different thing, and a thing that took time, and that couldn't be taught directly, but only lived alongside until it arrived on its own. The buggy had gone down the road an hour ago. The boundary road was empty in both directions now. Somewhere past the fence line, a horse was moving through the far field. She could see it through the spruce, a dark shape drifting slow through the pale new grass that had come in green and uncertain at the edges of the snowmelt, still deciding what it was. She set another row on the sock she'd started after the mittens, because his socks had gone through at both heels by February, and she'd patched them herself twice, which was fine, patches held, but new ones would be warmer and last longer. Red wool, the same as the mittens, because she'd bought enough for both when she bought it. Behind her, the chair scraped once and went still. "The man's gone," the boy said. "Gun," she said. A pause. "Is he coming back?" She said a stitch. "Not for us," she said, "not after today." She heard him push back from the table. His boots crossed the floor toward the door. He came and stood beside her on the step, close enough that his shoulder was at her elbow, and looked down the empty road in the direction the buggy had taken. She moved the needles without looking at her hands. The horse in the far field lifted its head once, then went back to the grass. A cloud crossed the sun and the light went sideways and cool for a moment, then came back warm. A long way down the road, past the last fence post she could make out, a crow called once and didn't repeat itself. "What's for dinner?" the boy said. "Whatever's in the pot." "You haven't started the pot." "No," she said, "I haven't." He stood there a moment longer, looking at the empty road. Then he went back inside, and she heard him at the woodbox, the cast iron door of the stove, the draft lever, the sound of him doing it the way she'd shown him in November. The right amount of wood, the right amount of air. He'd gotten it wrong the first month, always too much or not enough, and she'd never said anything about the not enough, only the too much, because too much was the one that mattered. He'd learned the rest himself. The road stayed empty. The needles kept moving. The sock grew another half-inch, slow and continuous, the way things grew here. Not fast, not with announcement, but a little more each day until one morning you looked up and something had become what it was always going to be, and you couldn't point to the exact moment it had crossed over. Only that it had. Only that you were on the other side of it now, and the ground felt different under you than it had before, and that was enough. She didn't move to go inside. Not yet. The pot could wait another few minutes. The stove would take a while to climb, and anyway the evening was warm enough for May. Warm in the way that meant the frost was done for real, not just resting. The ground past the fence line had turned the color of new money, pale green and unsure of itself, the kind of color that always surprised you a little when it came back, even when you knew it was coming. She sat on the step with the sock in her lap and the needles moving. And somewhere inside the house a door opened and then closed, and that was the sound of someone who knew where he was.